If you've followed me for a while, you'll know that my dad died very suddenly when I was 19. And in the immediate aftermath, it was intensely emotional, obviously. But it didn't take long for that to kind of pass. And then I just couldn't get to it anymore. I couldn't name it. I couldn't feel it in any way that I could really actively describe. And the maddening thing, the thing that made me feel like I was somehow doing grief wrong, betraying him even, is that I could feel it for other people. Someone would tell me about losing someone they loved, and I'd be floored by it, completely gutted for them, feeling their loss much more deeply than I could feel my own. And sometimes the only way I could connect to my own grief was through someone else's. Like I needed to kind of borrow or piggyback their feelings because mine had been put somewhere that I just didn't have the key to. And for years and years and years, I thought that that meant that there was something wrong with me, something cold or broken, or I don't know, just missing, full stop. But actually what it meant was that I'd grown up in an environment where my own feelings were dangerous, but other people's feelings were essential. Because if you didn't track other people's emotional states, things got worse. So I did what any sensible child does in that situation. I got incredibly good at reading everyone else and quietly stopped reading myself. Overdeveloped empathy for others, which is really hypervigilance in a nicer outfit, and alexithymia for my own stuff. And I know some of you will have heard me say this before because it's something I talk about a lot. People who call themselves empaths, who've always been told they're so sensitive and so good at reading people, are very often not experiencing some kind of gift. They're experiencing hypervigilance that they learnt in childhood because they had to. Reading the room wasn't a talent, it was a survival strategy, and it came at the cost of reading themselves. Add ADHD to that, where your working memory is already kind of compromised, and connecting to how you feel about something requires cognitive resources you may or may not have on any given Tuesday. And you've got someone who can cry at a John Lewis advert, but can't tell you what she's feeling about her own life. It'd be funny if it wasn't so disorientating, but there we are. I wonder if any of you could relate to that, because I think a lot of you probably can. Maybe not the specifics exactly, but the kind of shape of it. You're better at knowing what other people feel than what you feel. And you've always assumed that you've always assumed that's a personality trait rather than a thing with an actual mechanism behind it, an explanation. Maybe it's actually a trauma response, wearing a cardigan. And meanwhile, when someone asks you how you are, you say, fine, and you mean it, because you genuinely can't access anything more specific than that, especially when everyone else is having big feelings about something that affects you just as much, but you can't connect to it because you're more focused on them. That's what this season starts with, because it sits underneath everything else. What happens when you don't know what you feel, how you got here, and what you actually do about it when your brain processes internal signals differently from the textbook, and nobody taught you how to read them in the first place. I know you've been asking yourself, am I the problem? Let's find out. With me, your host, Helen Villiers. You're going through your day, for example, and someone asks you, what's wrong? And you say, nothing. And you're not lying, you're not suppressing something, you're not being brave or stoic or even avoidant. You genuinely don't register that anything is wrong. And then 3 hours later, you burst into tears in the supermarket car park with absolutely no bloody idea why. And you feel like you're going mad because the crying came from apparently nowhere, except it didn't come from nowhere. It came from 3 hours of something building that you couldn't, not didn't, big difference, detect. Or maybe the other version, you know something's happening, you know you feel bad, you can tell it's, that much, but bad is about as specific as you can get. Is it sadness, anxiety, anger, hunger, tiredness? All of those things produce a version of bad in your body, and you cannot for the life of you tell them apart. So you end up treating them the same, or you end up treating them all the same way. which usually means eating something or going to bed or snapping at someone or just shutting down entirely. Because when you can't identify what you feel, you definitely can't respond to it appropriately. There's a word for this. It's called alexithymia, which literally translates to no words for feelings. It's fabulous. And it was coined by a psychiatrist called Peter Sifnios, and I may have pronounced that horribly, so apologies. But it was coined by him in the 1970s. It's not a diagnosis, it's a trait. It sits on a spectrum. And some people have it all the time, some have it situationally, some only under stress. About 10% of the general population have what we would call clinically significant levels of it. But in autistic people, that number is closer to 50%. And in people with ADHD, it's around 40%. So if you're sitting in the intersection of neurodivergent and traumatized, which is where most of you are if you're listening to this, the odds of you experiencing some degree of alexithymia are really quite high. And yet, nobody's probably ever even mentioned the word to you. And the reason I'm starting this season here is because everything else we're going to talk about, the amplified reactions, the apologizing, the fear or difficulty setting boundaries, the relationship patterns, all of it requires you to be able to identify what you're feeling. And if you can't do that, if the data your brain is working with is wrong or missing or scrambled, then all the therapy and all the boundary scripts and all the self-help books in the world are building on a foundation that isn't there. There's a neurological piece and there's a trauma piece, and they kind of layer on top of each other in a way that actually makes both worse. So let's go with the neurological bit first. If you're autistic, there's a decent chance you have what's called atypical interoception. Interoception is your brain's ability to read signals from inside your body. Your heartbeat, your digestion, your temperature, your muscle tension, even the need to go to the loo. It's sometimes called your eighth sense, which I actually rather like because it sounds more exciting rather than clinical. And what the research tells us is that a significant proportion of autistic people don't process these signals in the typical way. The signals are there, your body is still doing the thing, but the message gets scrambled somewhere between the body and the brain's interpretation of it. So your heart might be racing and your stomach might be churning and your brain just registers that as a thing that is happening without the helpful label of, oh, that's anxiety or, oh, that's anger. What's interesting, and this is where it gets a lot more nuanced than people make it, than a lot of people make it, is that alexithymia and autism are actually distinct. They overlap a lot. About half of autistic people have alexithymia, as I've said, but the other half don't. My daughter, for example, she's nearly 10. She's autistic, she's ADHD, she's dyspraxic, and she can name feelings with a precision that genuinely puts most adults to shame. And I say that with absolute confidence because I have been told it. I've seen it. People going, whoa, that's amazing. But my son, on the other hand, who is 18 and autistic, he's completely different. If you ask him how he's feeling, you'll get a long pause and then not much. And it's not that he doesn't have the feelings. He clearly does. It's just that the connection between having the feeling and being able to identify and name it works really differently for him. Same household, same attitude to emotions, i.e. they're welcome whatever they look like. Completely different presentations, because alexithymia isn't autism. It co-occurs with it. And that distinction matters because it changes what you actually do about it. If you've got ADHD as well, or instead, there's another layer to this. ADHD involves dopamine regulation, and dopamine is involved in how your brain processes emotional information. The research shows alexithymia rates of around 40% in people with ADHD, as we've seen. And the working theory is that it's partly about dopamine dysfunction affecting emotional processing and partly about executive function, because identifying a feeling isn't just a passive thing that happens to you. It's actually a cognitive process. Your brain has to notice the body signal, attend to it, interpret it, match it to a category, and produce a label. That's quite a lot of steps if you think about it. And every single one of them requires executive function. So when your executive function is already compromised, which it is in ADHD, and especially when it's compromised further by fatigue or stress or high cognitive load, the whole system degrades. And there's another ADHD piece here that the community, including myself, sometimes calls emotional impermanence. And I want to be really clear that that's not actually a clinical term, but it captures something really real, because what's actually happening is actually a working memory issue. Your working memory is the system that keeps information active and available in your mind. And in ADHD, it doesn't hold things in place the way it's supposed to. So you can feel something intensely, genuine grief or anger or hurt, and then 2 hours later, you can't get back to it. The feeling was real. It hasn't gone anywhere, but your working memory has moved on to the next thing and you've lost access to the emotion, which is why you end up feeling like you don't care enough about things you care about enormously, and why connecting to your own emotional life can feel like trying to grab something in water, like you're trying to hold something that you can see but you can't touch, or maybe there's an image of it, a mirage of it. You can see it but you can't quite get hold of it. It's the same mechanism that makes you put something in a cupboard and then kind of functionally forget it exists. Not me ordering 2 of the same things because I didn't remember I had one in the cupboard already, but you forget that it exists, not because you genuinely think it's vanished from reality, but because your brain doesn't keep things active in your awareness without a sensory cue. The emotional version of that is, I think, one of potentially the cruelest features of ADHD, and it's almost never talked about. I know this from my own experience, actually. I can absolutely be fine at identifying what I'm feeling when I'm rested, when my cognitive load is manageable, and then maybe I have a week where everything piles up and I am tired and I'm stretched and I'm suddenly right back to something is happening, I don't know what it is. After all the therapy, all the training, the masters, all of it, because it's not actually about knowledge or education or learning, it's about cognitive resources. And when you run out of those, the skill goes offline. Of course it does. The trauma piece, though, is where it gets properly tangled, because alexithymia doesn't just come from neurodivergent wiring. It also comes from childhood emotional environments. The meta-analyses are really clear on this, actually. The emotional abuse and emotional neglect are the strongest predictors of alexithymia in adulthood, stronger than physical abuse, stronger than sexual abuse. And what is a toxic parent if not someone who either actively punishes your emotions, whether overtly or covertly, or fails entirely to help you learn what they are? Because children don't just come out of the womb knowing what sadness feels like, they learn it. A toddler falls over and cries, and a good enough parent says, "Oh, that was scary, you're okay, but that hurt." And what they're doing is talking the child's internal experience, which is just a big undifferentiated mass of distress at that point, and reflecting it back with a label. That's scared, that's hurt, that's frustrated. Over thousands of these interactions, the child builds an internal map based, it must be said, on the parent's instruction, which is where also it can get a bit muddled. But they build this internal map. This sensation in my body means this feeling, and this feeling has this name. It's not instinctive, it's learned, and it's learned through having someone attune to your emotional state and reflect it back accurately. Accurately being the key word, I suppose. A toxic parent doesn't do this. They either ignore the child's emotional state entirely because they're too preoccupied with their own, or they override it. "You're not upset, stop being silly," or they co-opt it. "You're not upset about that. You're upset because you don't love your mother enough." The child's actual emotional experience is never accurately reflected back. They're told, "Oh, you're being silly," or they're just never given the language. I call it the emotional library. It's a reference library that you don't get when you grow up in these environments. So it means the map never ever gets built, and the child adapts because children are remarkably good at adapting to impossible situations. And what they adapt by doing is turning down the volume on their own internal signals, not consciously, not deliberately. The system just learns that those signals weren't useful information because nobody responds to them in a way that helps, and expressing them actively makes things worse. And at the same time, the child turns up the volume on everyone else's signals because that's where the useful, protective information is. The hypervigilance and the alexithymia aren't separate things. They're two slides of the same adaptation. So now you've got a neurodivergent child whose interoceptive signals were already non-standard, growing up in a toxic environment where the process of learning to read those signals is actively and aggressively disrupted. The neurodivergence makes the signals harder to read. The trauma means that nobody teaches you how to read them. And the combination produces an adult who genuinely, honestly, does not know what they feel. And I just want to pause there for a second because that's quite a lot to take in. Your system did exactly what it was supposed to do with the conditions it was given. It's not broken, it's adapted. And the fact that adaptation isn't serving you anymore is not the same as that adaptation being your fault. The child you were did the best work they could with what they had. And I think that deserves acknowledging before we talk about what to do next. The thing about this that I find particularly cruel is that this adult then gets pathologized for it. They get told they're emotionally unavailable or shut down, or that they need to connect with their feelings as though their feelings are somewhere in a room that they've chosen not to enter, rather than genuinely inaccessible. Partners get frustrated, therapists get frustrated, the person themselves get frustrated because they can see that other people seem to have access to emotional information that they don't, and they assume it's a personal failing. It's not. It's not a personal failing. It's a completely logical outcome of neurodivergent wiring in a toxic environment. I'm going to go deeper into the interoception piece and how it actually works in the body and what you can practically do to start improving those signals in the Expert Series episode that goes with this one. And if this episode is making you think, well, great, Helen, but what do I actually do about the body bit? That's where I'll get into it really properly. So if this episode's got you thinking, and especially if it's got you thinking, right, I actually need to do something about this, the Hub is where I go deeper. It's my coaching membership, and it's where the real work happens. This week's Expert Series goes further into the interoception piece, how your body signals work and what to do when they don't. And honestly, if the idea of building your own body emotion map sounds good in theory, but you're already thinking, I'll forget, the Hub is where I actually walk you through it. There's courses, there's live calls with me, there's a community of amazing people who get it because they're living it too. It's not group therapy. It's more like a room full of people who've all read the same book and want to talk about it, except the book is your life and everyone's copy has the same chapters. You can find it at liberationacademy.co.uk/the-hub. Come and have a look and join in. We'd love to see you there. Take care. Bye. Right, what do you do about it then? Because I'm not going to pretend that this is going to be a quick fix. It isn't. You're essentially trying to build a skill that should have been developing since you were about 18 months old, if not earlier. And you're doing it with a brain that processes internal signals differently from the textbook. So the standard advice is going to need adjusting. Start tracking body sensations without trying to label them as emotions. And this sounds almost too simple, perhaps, but it's genuinely the foundation. Because most emotional awareness exercises start at the wrong point. They say, notice what you're feeling, which presupposes that you can distinguish between feelings, and you probably can't, at least not reliably anyway. So start earlier in the chain. Start with the body, not what am I feeling, but what is happening in my body right now. Tight shoulders, clenched jaw, churning stomach, buzzy legs. And for those of you with ADHD who are already thinking, I'll forget to do that. Yep, you probably will, which is why you need an external cue. And there's no shame. Let's just put that very clearly on the table. There is no shame that you're going to forget at all. I do all the time, not a big deal. But you need the external cue. So set a reminder on your phone. 3 times a day is plenty. When it goes off, spend 30 seconds doing nothing except noticing what your body is doing. You don't need to write it down, although you can, of course, and you don't need to understand it. You're just building the habit of checking in, which is the interoceptive equivalent of learning to look at the petrol gauge before the engine starts sputtering, So once you've got that habit, even loosely in place, you can start building your own associations between body states and emotions. And I mean your own, not the ones on a flipping feelings chart, much as I love a feelings chart. But here is the thing about feelings charts. They're made for neurotypical bodies, okay? And I do rely on them, but with the assumption that I have just given you that you would already know what's happening in your body. So that is not fair. So what we need to do is go back and do your own version of the feelings wheel or whatever it might be. So what we want to know is, or what we should know rather, is that the way anxiety shows up in your autistic body might be completely different from the textbook description. I know people for whom anxiety feels like a need to use the loo. I mean, we all know about the nervous wee. I actually wonder if there's any kind of study on how many people with ADHD or autism have the nervous wee compared to neurotypicals, but that's by the by. Anyway, I know people for whom anger feels like an itch. You know, the standard descriptions don't apply to everyone. And if your interoception is atypical, relying on someone else's map is going to keep leading you to the wrong destination. Of course. So what you do is you work backwards. You wait for a time when you know what you're feeling. You could think back to a time where you knew what you were feeling too, but you need a time when the emotion is obvious because the situation makes it unmistakable, and you use that moment to catalogue the body sensations. You've just had a blazing row with someone and you're obviously angry. Fine. What is your body doing right now? You also might be hurt, disappointed, upset, feeling injustice and all of those things. But let's go with the anger bit. What is your body doing right now? That's your anger data. Your friend just called and cancelled on you and you're obviously disappointed. Maybe you're relieved. I don't know. But fine. What is your body doing? That's your disappointment or relief data. Over time, slowly, you're building a personal reference library, not from a feelings wheel, not from a list, but from your own body's actual signals. Now, you also need to know that this is going to be wildly inconsistent, and the inconsistency is not your failing, it's the ADHD piece again. Your ability to do this will vary with your cognitive load, and the same is true for autism. On a good day, rested, not too many demands, you might be quite good at noticing your internal state. On a bad day, overwhelmed, tired, too many tabs open in your brain, you will lose the ability almost entirely and revert to, I feel bad or I feel nothing. That's not a step backwards. That's executive function being a limited resource that gets allocated to whatever's most urgent. And when you're overwhelmed, name this feeling, it's not urgent. The skill isn't gone. The resources to run it are just temporarily elsewhere, okay? But it also is good information, actually, to know that your executive load is high when you're unable to connect with it. So there's good reflection in that itself. What helps with this practically is actually having a very short list, and I mean 3 to 5 words, that you use as your low battery options when you can't tell what you're feeling. So you don't need the whole full vocabulary. You need pleasant, unpleasant, high energy, low energy, or none. That's it. You can work with that. You don't need to know the difference between melancholy and grief and disappointment when your executive function is on the floor. Like, you just need to know unpleasant, low energy. That gives you enough information to respond, and that's the actual point. Not eloquence about your emotional state, but enough information to respond in a way that helps rather than hurts. And this connects to something actually that's going to be controversial with some of the therapy world, standard Villiers, but stop trying to feel your feelings in the moment if you can't. I know that goes against literally everything you've been told. I know feel your feelings is practically a commandment in therapeutic culture, but if you have alexithymia, demanding that you feel something is like, in real time, is like demanding that someone with dyslexia read faster. It just doesn't happen. The processing happens on a delay. You might not know what you felt about something until hours later or the next day, or until you're in the shower or driving or doing something that reduces cognitive load enough for the emotional processing to finally come through. It's not avoidance. That's your processing speed. So work with it. Give yourself permission to say, I don't know what I feel about this yet. I need to come back to it. And then actually come back to it. This is particularly important actually in relationships, by the way. If you've got a partner who wants to process things in real time and you literally cannot access your emotional response in real time, You need a shared understanding of what's happening, not I don't care or I'm shutting down. Something like, I can tell something's happening, but I can't read it yet. Can we come back to this tonight? That's not avoidance. That's just accurate self-reporting, which is, ironically, exactly the emotional skill everyone's been telling you to develop. So, the uncomfortable part, let's go there. Understanding why you can't identify your feelings is important. It's genuinely important. It changes how you relate to yourself. It takes away the shame. It explains 100 things that have confused and frustrated you and the people around you for years, and which has then reinforced your feelings about your not being good enoughness, your brokenness, But it's also not a full stop. It's a comma. Because once you understand the mechanism, you become responsible to yourself for working with it, not fixing it. I don't think fixing is the right word, and I don't think it's fully fixable, to be honest. I'm a psychotherapist with a master's in this exact subject, and I still lose the ability to identify my feelings when I'm tired and overloaded. But working with it, yeah, absolutely. That's yours now. And the person that benefits most from that work is you. And the bit that will annoy you is this. You're probably quite good at this point as using the mechanism as an explanation to other people. You've got the language now. You can say, I have alexithymia, or I'm neurodivergent, or I grew up in a toxic environment. And all those things are all true, and they're all valid. But the person that you're most likely to still be hiding from with those explanations is you. Because I can't identify my feelings becomes quite a comfortable place to live if it means you never have to try. You get to stay in the numbness or in the vague, something is wrong, and you don't have to do the uncomfortable work of actually building the skill because you've got a diagnosis-shaped reason not to. One of the things I talk about in this episode is how your ability to identify your feelings degrades when your cognitive load is high. And if you're thinking, well, my cognitive load is high approximately always at work, I built something for that. Apereo Profiles is cognitive and personality profiling for the workplace. It's not a diagnosis, and it's not one of those personality quizzes that tells you like a blue dolphin or whatever. It's a proper profile of how your executive function works alongside your personality, and it comes with practical recommendations. What your employer gets is an actual understanding of how you work best, what drains you, and what they can do about it. What you get is language for the things you've been trying to explain about yourself for years. It's for individuals, managers, and HR teams. You can find more at aperioprofiles.co.uk. And if you've spent your career being told you're not meeting your potential when actually your workplace just isn't set up for the way your brain processes things, this is for you. The goal isn't to become someone who has a perfect emotional awareness. The goal is to become someone who knows they have imperfect emotional awareness and has strategies for working with that. Someone who can say, I'm having a reaction and I can't name it yet, instead of either exploding or going silent. Someone who can check in with their body even when it's inconvenient. Someone who's willing to close the gap between what they feel and what they know, even slowly, even imperfectly. That's the work. And it's not glamorous. It doesn't make for a good Instagram post, but it's honest. And it's yours to do for yourself, not to perform for anyone else. So there it is. Be kind to yourself in it. So thank you for being here for the start of season 2. I'm really excited for what's coming up. Next week, we're talking about something the thing that connects to this one most directly, how you can't tell if you're having an over-amplified reaction when you were raised by someone who told you that every reaction was an overreaction. If you've got a story about a time you genuinely couldn't tell whether your response to something was proportionate, I'd love to hear it. You can tell me on socials or email helen@liberationacademy.co.uk. Thank you again for listening, and as ever, all that remains to be said is take care.